Hi, this is Paul. In response to my fudgy psychedelic attempt to retcon Christianity video was even more than anticipated. I usually get between 50 and 100 comments on a video in the first day, and it was very quickly over 200 and 300 and 400. So yeah, as someone said, this is even more touchy than the same-sex marriage topic. Isn't that funny? Isn't that just funny? So I've got more to say about it, and I originally thought this was just going to be a short video to address some of the things, but it might not be quite that short. Surprise, surprise. First thing I want to say is you have to pay attention to the title. What's my main critique in that video? It's the retconning Christianity and the Christian story. I think it doesn't hold water. I don't think it holds water at all. So that's why I commented on the after school video and not on the Peterson conversation directly, because I thought the after school video made the retcon argument about as clear as possible, at least without reading the book. And now I've started to read the book. And, well, that's what the video was about. The idea that somehow mass consumption of some chemical agent will... now notice, all you have to do with this thing is ask people to say, okay, please tell me in specific terms how this will work out. It's sort of analogous to John McWhorter when he talks about when people say it's time for America to come to terms with racism. And he says, okay, exactly what do you mean? I can imagine a soundtrack, but please tell me in concrete terms how things will be differently. And what you discover very quickly is that things start to fall apart. It's very difficult to establish sort of an eschatological trail, a telos, a pathway to a telos if you work through this narrative. I think it just falls apart. You have to ask yourself, well, what would be one? Well, go ahead, paint some utopia. And, in terms of Jordan Peterson, a number of you said, I don't know why Jordan Peterson keeps going on about this issue. And I agree with that sentiment. What he says early on in his conversation is that he's hoping that this will somehow arrest the decline of Christianity. And, Peterson regularly seems to have concern about that, as does Tom Holland, as do many other people. But you might think, is my volume too low? You might think if you really want to do something about that, well, you yourself can go to church. And he still doesn't. So I don't know why people think, again, I don't know what imagined Christian revival, more widespread use of psychedelics are going to invoke. And I'm going to get into this a little bit later in this video. What exactly does Jordan Peterson have in mind in terms of what a reversal might mean? It's hard to say beyond an unwinding of the woke culture war elements, which he most often draws attention to. And I've addressed that in my Blue Church videos, where I don't think Blue Church is coming back. And whereas Jordan Peterson has become a heretic in the Blue Church, I would think, sort of imagines a return to some degree of much more open rationality, which actually in some ways puts him sort of in the middle of a bunch of categories I'm about to lay out for you. So this is a still from the Best Kept Secret in History video. And you think, maybe if everyone's taking psychedelics in communion, then church services will look more like this, which for those of you listening, I've got some, I don't know, it's probably a very famous Renaissance painting, with a bunch of naked people dancing in the park. And now this, again, like so many things, if you just pause and think about it a little bit more, the whole thing starts to come undone. We might chuckle and imagine, well, a naked orgy would certainly bring people back to church, wouldn't it? I suppose I could put a sign on Living Stone's wall. Naked orgies every Friday night must be over 21. Okay, and then we can have lots of beer and wine, and we can even do it without psychedelics. Maybe you need psychedelics in order to do it. I don't think so, but you might say, well, then people would come flocking to living stones and it would be in the news. And yeah, and how long would it last? Because legally, there's nothing. We could have people sign consent forms and, all kinds of legal things in order to protect ourselves, to say that everyone who's coming to our Living Stones naked orgy will not hold the organization liable, yada, yada, and they're consenting adults, yada, yada, and so on and so forth. Would it last? Well, and almost all of us would say no. Well, why wouldn't it last? Well, think about it. You can't live this way. There's a structure to life, and the kinds of norms that have developed for reasons. There's no law against consenting adults doing this sort of thing. Why isn't it common? Why isn't it public? I mean, surely it happens in some places. I'm never invited, nor have I looked for it to be invited to, because I think, frankly, it would be destructive to my marriage and obviously to my church job and to the rest of my life. And I would also imagine that having done it once or twice, that might be all people want to do because, well, again, I think you all get the point. This type of behavior is unsustainable and destructive to the type of fabric of life we need for flourishing long-term and intergenerationally. And of course, Jordan Peterson knows that. I mean, he can come out of the gate sounding positively puritanical about some things. But so what exactly do you have in mind that the psychedelics would produce if somehow elevated to a place of greater status and greater prominence? Now, my personal take on this is pretty moderate. I read Michael Pollan's book and I really enjoyed it. And he came at it from sort of a rationalist, physicalist perspective. And I'll draw some of those categories in a little bit. And from what I'm told, with, something serious like, Johns Hopkins studying these things, that there are beneficial. I'm not going to deny them. Who am I to say? I don't know anything about this. But study it. Those who want to study it, volunteer for the research. I don't have any problem about that. From what I'm told, it doesn't seem like the world would end if the drugs were less restricted. Plenty of people use it. In fact, as is often the case with a lot of black market things, if perhaps it was allowed in some legal, regulated fashion, one way or another, perhaps it would be beneficial and therapeutic. I'm not denying any of that. Part of what my last 3 years has shown me is that many people that I interact with and respect don't speak ill of these drugs and claim they've had positive effects on their lives. I'm not doubting them. I have no argument with them. The point of the video was about the retconning of Christianity and, well, my skepticism that somehow mass assumption of these substances would yield the kingdom of God on earth or utopia or any eschatological motif that you wish to frame. Color me skeptical. So I started reading the book, and the foreword by Graham Hancock was about as predictable as the kinds of church services he lamented having to go to as a young man were. Because his story was sort of a typical secularist deconstruction story, and how he became an atheist and how he tried these and how he does these things fairly often. And, well, now he's not so sure, but he still considers himself an atheist. And, well, this is wonderful in his life that he goes to these ayahuasca ceremonies regularly, yada, 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 yada. Again, I don't think he should be arrested. I'm not saying he should lose status. But, Bern Powers, I pinned Bern's comment right to the top. And it rings true for my experience. I'm a little younger than Bern, but I grew up in the New York area and people were playing with all kinds of things. And the way I measure effectiveness is basically, in some ways, Piaget's equilibrated state. Is it doing a lot of good? Does it build a civilization? Is it helping to produce healthy intergenerational families over the long term? Again, someone might say, well, I did some psychedelics for a while and that really opened me up and turned me on and I got my life in order. And I'd say, and psychedelics were important with that. I'd say, great. I'm not arguing with you. I know other people who would say, I became a terrible drunk and I joined AA and I got my act together and I went to church and now my life is a lot better. Great. I'm not saying drawing an equivalency between doing psychedelics and being a drunk. I'm just saying there's a lot of paths to self-improvement. They're out there. Many people, for some people, it's the birth of their child. For some people, it's hitting their wife and realizing, oh my gosh, I'm one of those. Some people, it's going to jail. Some people, some people, they just sat up one day and said, my life's not going anywhere, and they changed directions. Some people are raging alcoholics and they just recognize it someday and they don't go to a 12-step program and they just stop drinking and life goes better. Lots of ways people change their mind, and it's fine. No argument there. The second piece early on in the first chapter was about these studies and talked about this woman who was an atheist and she was had fear of dying and fear of death. Now, again, fear of death is not uncommon. I'm sure some of her atheism had impacted her fear of dying. Maybe her parents were Catholic or Christian or something. I've known Christians that had anxiety about death. I've known Christians that have had no anxiety about death. A lot of this has to do with the way you live. Worldviews have consequences. But beneath all of these things are often unexamined moral matrices that are in fact consequences of particular worldviews. We sort of have a public register of good and bad that we implicitly keep, but explicitly avoid talking about in many respects. Oh, you're afraid of dying. That's a bad thing. No, if it means you're going to creep back from the edge of the Grand Canyon or the bridge, we would say fear of dying is a good thing. I mean, life is complicated. The woman is afraid of dying. These drugs helped reduce her anxiety. 75% said it was a meaningful experience. I can talk about many meaningful experiences in my life that didn't involve any kind of chemicals. Some of them were positive, some of them were negative. Again, this isn't an argument about, I'm just trying to say, let's stop. Let's just look at what we're saying and examine it a little bit more closely. If we gave drugs to prisoners so that they no longer had negative emotions about their crime, would that be a good thing? Oh, all these people in jail are feeling guilty. A lot of people would say, I've been to jail, done prison ministry. A lot of those people aren't feeling guilty enough. Is guilt a positive or a negative? And almost everyone will say, well, it depends. And what it depends on is their moral worldview. That's what it depends. The prisoner should feel guilty. The prisoner should be afraid of incarceration. This person is fearing incarceration, so let's give them a psychedelic, and now they feel one with the universe, so they no longer fear incarceration. We live in a world that has an assumption about what fears are helpful and what fears are harmful, and that helpfulness and harmfulness has a whole lot to do with the shape of the rest of the worldview. What if we gave drugs to middle-aged people who were anxious about their retirement savings? Let's get rid of all their anxiety. And some would say, hey, wait a minute. Maybe their anxiety about not having enough savings for retirement is a good thing. Maybe now they'll buckle down and have savings for retirement. Let's give psychedelics to college kids who are facing deadlines so they no longer worry about their term paper deadline. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Again, fears, anxieties, we sort of label these as negative emotions, but our label of them depends greatly on this often assumed, often not terribly well explored moral matrix beneath the fear and anxiety, because we would say we should be afraid of some things. We should have negative emotions about some things. Should we banish all negative emotions? that doesn't seem like a plausible idea, and I don't imagine most of you would say it is, but it's sort of trotted out as, well, now people are no longer afraid of death. Is that a positive thing? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe if they're afraid of meeting their maker at the end of their life, they'll call their family to them and, in fact, make some restitution for the wrongs that they've done. I have a conversation that will be, so while the pace of videos coming out on my channel will slow greatly over the next few weeks, just giving you a little warning. And I've got some conversations that I've been storing up, and because they're a lot less time conscious than these videos, and so I will be releasing them while I'm gone. And the Friday question and answers, those will continue without me, but with some special guests, and some of those guests some of you will want to listen to. And so if you want to ask a question, get into Bridges of Meaning and go figure it out. But one of the conversations I had, which is a really cool conversation, was about death. And in our culture, we don't die well. And we don't die well partly because we're living fearful of death. And this isn't even just simply a religious thing. Throughout the centuries, when death was quite a bit more present, people would basically live their life in preparation for their death. Sort of how we're admonished today to live our life in preparation for our retirement, or students are told to live their life in preparation for the end of the semester, or we're told to live our life in preparation for longevity, so you should eat a certain way and you should exercise a certain way, or and. Anxieties and fears are not necessarily negative. It's all a function of the worldview that is there, looked at it or not. Now, a number of years ago, Maxwell had really an outstanding video. I don't even know if it's still up on his Self-Wire channel about how any idiot can memorize the entire history of philosophy in 30 minutes. And it's actually an excellent video. I listened to it a number of times. It's been in some of my videos before, and he sort of lays out Ontology-Epistemology-Axiology, lays it out quite nicely. The current psychedelic discussion transcends two of the current ontological camps, okay? And I'm going to call them here Rationalist Physicalists, and Sam Harris would probably be a good candidate for that, and as well as Lawrence Krauss. And I'll call the other group Optimistic Contemporary Spiritual Pluralists, all right? And if you want to pause the video and think about each word, I chose each word with a degree of care. Now, they're in contrast to many Christians I would categorize as traditional spiritualist. Well, what do I mean by the difference between a spiritualist and a physicalist? Well, a physicalist assumes that physicality and physics and materiality is primary, and a lot of these higher cognition elements are emergent. Okay? That's sort of the reigning worldview. So consciousness is an emergent property from physics. It's all of this stuff comes together and poof, consciousness comes out. So that's a physicalist. A spiritualist would probably say something like consciousness is more foundational. Now there's idealists out there, and I still haven't watched Vervaeke's conversation with Bernard Castro. Is it Castro? I still haven't watched that conversation, but some people are pestering me about that. So spiritualists are a little bit different from necessarily idealists, although some idealists would be spiritualists and probably some of them wouldn't be. But spiritualists basically say that, just traditionally God is spirit, and so God is, physicality is a product of the spiritual is first and the physical is second. Okay? So again, some of the two promoters that I hear with respect to psychedelics are rationalist physicalists like Sam Harris, and he talks them up. And I'd say optimistic contemporary spiritual pluralists who, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. Traditional spiritualists, like most traditional Christians, are very cautious about this. Jonathan Peugeot is in that category. I would say probably Bishop Barron is in that category. I'm in that category. Why? Because we believe that, there are good and evil beings. There are good and evil spirits. So don't open doors you can't manage. And so when you get to the Jordan Peterson conversation with the doctor running the Johns Hopkins thing, and they talk about having these conversations and having a posture of openness towards whatever being approaches you in your psychedelic state, most Christians will say, I'm not going to adopt that posture because I am not exactly sure what's on the other end of the line. And now there's reasons why a rationalist physicalist would say there's absolutely nothing to worry about because that's just in your head, or an optimistic contemporary spiritual pluralist would say the spiritual world is the garden of delights. It's only down here in materiality where things go wrong, in which case they're sort of redoing some of the more Gnostic-y cultures and traditions that are in the ancient world. It sort of says spirit is good, materiality is bad, spiritual is eternal, materiality is subject to decay, on and on and on and on and on. Those are very ancient ways of thinking. Some of those ways of thinking are still around us in new clothing. So the rationalist physicalists look at psychedelics, as Sam Harris does, and or other spiritual practices such as meditation. He, of course, has a meditation app. They believe their moral matrix is more or less self-evident, which I find to be a laughable thing. I'd say their moral matrix is, in fact, a la Tom Holland, simply the residue of Christianity in their culture. But they don't want to give any credit to Christianity for it because they find Christianity to be the problem and not a solution, and certainly not a positive contributor. So, well, there you have it. So harm is identified as positive or negative emotion, and I think semi-naively. And that's where, well, she's afraid to die. That's negative emotion. So if the psychedelic helps her no longer be afraid to die, and again, this is within bounds. There might be some people whose lives are completely destroyed because they're afraid of dying, and I agree. Maybe some therapy, maybe some psychedelics, I don't know, might make that manageable. I know many people who are anxious about things they should be anxious about in debilitating ways, and we often say they have an anxiety disorder. And, you know, I know many people who currently take pharmaceuticals in order to help their anxiety. And I am, you know, if in fact some of the people that I know who have anxiety disorders, if in fact, let's say, one particular regimen or treatment with a psychedelic would be very helpful for getting them unstuck, I'm not opposed to it. But many of the people that I know who are dealing with significant anxiety are also dealing with other, and again, I was talking to a real scientist and a real psychologist today, and I said, my take on psychology is sort of analogous to folk religion. I deal with it sort of in a practical way with people all the time, but it's not my area of expertise. And so I am not a person giving diagnoses over the internet because I am not a doctor and I don't play one on YouTube. But many of the people that I see who are in many ways disabled by anxiety also struggle with psychosis, other pretty significant, they might hear voices. Their grasp on this public reality is tenuous. I'm not a doctor. I'd have questions about sending them on an LSD trip in order to treat their anxiety. Would it help? I'll defer to the doctors. But I'm dubious. I'm cautious. So harm identified as positive or negative emotion. I already talked about that. Sometimes probably the right amount of anxiety is good. Too much anxiety is unhelpful. But all of those moral evaluations are made within a far broader matrix and worldview. You know, you have the implicit justification for harm in the right cases, which, again, this is all of those moral judgments are made within the fuller matrix of a worldview. And I often find with this group of people, well, we want to oppose suffering unless it's bigots and racists and religious people who are suffering. And therefore, their suffering is good because their suffering will get them on the right path to no longer being whatever it is that's in them that we think is wrong. Now, consciousness, of course, because they're physicalists, is an emergent property. And again, their argument for this, which is a powerful argument, says we can manipulate consciousness with drugs. And so for physicalists, psychedelics are in some ways attractive because they see it as validating their ontology, and therefore they see it as a powerful tool to achieve the kinds of ends their worldview is pursuing. And for that reason, psychedelics seem to hold a lot of promise for rational physicalists. Michael Pollan, the book that he wrote, is fundamentally a rational physicalist. Okay? So whatever the practice or the chemicals produced, it's always only in your head. More and more, they're talking about the intersubjective. More and more, I think we're going to see rationalist physicalists go away. They are, in fact, not going to endure as long as the religious people. I think, in fact, their worldview is in great danger, and increasingly so with every coming decade. It doesn't mean that the physical level isn't powerful. I think what we're going to see is a much deeper, more integrated worldview. And, for that reason, even though John Vervaeke and I disagree with respect to his physicalism, he's on to something in terms of the dynamic transjective nature of consciousness and reality. And in fact, I find that to be wholly in keeping with what the anthropology that I find already present in the Bible. So for a person like this, for a rationalist physicalist, there are few downsides as long as nobody gets hurt. And again, hurt or not hurt is subject to the moral matrix of their worldview. And again, there's an implicit unexplicated normativity and some normative agreements down below, which usually are seldom insufficiently fleshed out. Now, I made comments about the fact that this guy laying on my stoop is in a drug-induced state of his own choosing. And people would say, and I get the point. Psychedelics are not addictive in the way that alcohol and other substances are. I get that. I agree to it. We usually don't find people lying around in their ayahuasca or LSD state. In fact, almost anybody who knows anything about these drugs would say on the corner of Florin Road is a bad place to have your trip. And in fact, I would say that for a lot of people, these drugs are much more of a middle-class drug because they're not necessarily going to make you unable to do your job. The question we might ask is, will it be reciprocally narrowing or reciprocally broadening? That's a very good question. The justification for psychedelics is a degree of professed or measured public welfare. And again, that is yet to be proven. Would psychedelics yield public welfare? I don't know. I'm skeptical. That's my point in these videos. This, however, is a helpful tell that undercuts the rationalist physicalist argument. Again, see Byrne Power's complaint. We don't really know whether use of psychedelics will in fact help people publicly. And the fact that, if all you're against is suffering, you can read Brave New World, because Brave New World had a narrative that pretty much undercutted suffering pretty effectively. Just get on Soma. But the whole point of Brave New World is something in us doesn't aspire to be, and Jordan Peterson's movement held this out. If you see your 25-year-old spending 15 hours a day on video games and not holding down a job, not bringing in an income, not contributing to the world in any subsequent way, most parents think, is this really what I wanted for my son? I would have hoped that he would have what? And almost all of those would haves are played out in the public space. Those are things that we admire publicly. We admire people who change the world in a positive way. Now,
Someone might argue that, well, Steve Jobs used LSD and Steve Jobs promoted this, and he said it contributed to his creativity. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I'm not in a place to judge. I do know that people claim that Adderall contributes to their productivity, and most of the stuff that I've read with respect to Adderall says it gives people a feeling like it's contributing to their productivity, and maybe that doesn't count for nothing. But in the end, measure it and see if, in fact, people who take psychedelic trips are more creative. And maybe they are. And you might say that's a good thing. But what is creativity worth? And is it true that a little bit more creativity is helpful, but too much creativity can disable you? Jordan Peterson continues to make the point, or at least he did for a long time, that highly creative people have difficulty monetizing their creativity. In other words, that's where we get the meme of starving artists. So maybe if we make a whole lot more people way more creative and a whole lot less anxious, we'll just have more starving artists there. Well, there's currently a labor shortage for people willing to wait tables and do menial tasks. And of course, living in California, the big ongoing joke is, and I've seen people do this, they move to LA to become an actor, and we can quote Joni Mitchell, waiting tables and shining shoes. So we might ask ourselves, how creative do we want people to be? Because just because they're creative doesn't mean they'll necessarily create something that the world over the long term will find helpful and useful. And I'll just say, to contribute to another ongoing debate, for the most part, I use Windows and Android. The rationalist physicalists, well, here's the thing about the psychedelics. In one way or another, ontology still matters, and it matters in this debate. For rationalist physicalists, ontology continues to control both their epistemology and their axiology to one degree or another. But rationalist physicalists are susceptible to conversion by psychedelics, which is very interesting, and you see this often. And in fact, some of the early parts of the book sort of point that out, that people often come into this as sort of hard-bitten rationalist physicalists, and well, they do some psychedelics and now they're not so sure. Now, some of those might become traditional spiritualists, but in after school, it seems like many just sort of become, well, more open. They won't necessarily no longer identify as an atheist, but, how much does that matter in terms of the public space? It's interesting that I wonder if in some ways Sam Harris isn't hurting his own cause by continuing to one degree or another, say that psychedelics are a good thing. Maybe his point is, I can do psychedelics all day long and I remain an atheist and a rationalistic physicalist, and good for you. I knew a woman who in the 80s, when crack cocaine first came out, she was a fundamentalist Christian, and she used to brag to me how, they say that just one hit from crack cocaine will make you an addict for sure. And this woman, who was a elderly fundamentalist Baptist, would brag to me about how strong her will is, and she just believes that she could do that hit of crack cocaine and she wouldn't become an addict. And I was, of course, at that point a college student and a seminarian, but the troll in me so badly wanted to score some crack and see if she'd smoke it just to test her. But I was not about to do that. But that certainly did play out in my mind. I thought, I'd like to see you smoke some crack, and then we'll see. Because for the most part, her pontification was sort of a sanctimonious self-righteousness, which was, she in some ways considered herself better than all those poor people that were addicted to crack cocaine. And I personally found that morally distasteful. But there it is. Maybe Sam Harris continues to talk about psychedelics like this woman talked about crack cocaine. See, I can take psychedelics and I can still remain an atheist. Well, there you go. But I think, as the book states, as many proponents from the spiritualist camp have stated about psychedelics, if there's one thing they seem to do, it's to make people more open. And when they get more open, maybe not all of them, but a good many of them start to get a little wobbly in their atheism. And again, I understand that some of you would say, yeah, they're no longer atheists, but what are they going to be? Are they going to do this and go to church? Is Christianity going to be revived because more people are doing this? Color me skeptical. There's a brand of spiritualism, I would say, that for Sam Harris, nested, at least in his mind, securely within his atheism, is his spirituality. And of course, that will be simply an emergent property of his physicalism that is sort of a lifestyle accessory so that he doesn't have to feel bad when he meets other spiritual people who are building cathedrals and talking about their the things that they've done and the things that they experience. Sam can walk in and say, I'm spiritual too. There you go. But which spiritualism? So I think After School pretty much, as best as I've heard, laid out halfway, because in the end, he sort of remains a physicalist, but he seems to be a physicalist amid half deconstruction. Optimistic contemporary spiritual pluralists, or pluralism, let's say that. Some of these flip back and forth as rationalist physicalists. The first two examples of the book seem to be that. They're now more open. The woman is no longer as anxious about death, and they're no longer so sure about their physicalism, but that's sort of where they want to stay, probably as a function of their sociological pressure, and they don't want to lose status among the rest of their atheist friends. So when they come out in public, they remain as atheists. It's sort of like, let's say 200 years ago, you had people flirting with all kinds of things, but when they'd come out in public, they continue to identify as Christians because they'd lose status by identifying as an atheist. Maybe the same holds true of American politicians. Steve Jobs is a great example of this. Steve Jobs sort of clung to his atheism, and then if you read the Walter Isaacson biography, which I thought was excellent, towards the end of his life, when the fruit and vegetables didn't cure his pancreatic cancer, and he was too late getting to the surgery, even though it was treatable, and then he realizes that he's dying, then suddenly starts to flirt with non-physicalist questions such as, is there life after death? So, but I don't think it's that important which box you put him in. These are all public boxes that we're more or less using to sort of peg each other in society. Whether or not we live beyond this life, there is nothing to fear. Now, this is the optimistic contemporary spiritual pluralists, because there's nothing out there but angels of light. And we can quite easily do the white magic because in the end, everything is good and everything is fine. And I think in some ways, some of this is a product of Protestantism, because what Protestantism sort of did effectively in the West was in some ways cure a lot of the ongoing anxiety of hell that medieval Roman Catholicism had pretty deeply in European society. Now, some of you might be surprised by that because evangelicals and fundamentalists and Protestants have been using hell as something to beat people with back into the church, all the way up into D. James Kennedy evangelism explosion. But I think for the most part, what happened in the culture, especially through the Cold War and after the counterculture and then into at the end of the 20th century, is hell became less and less imaginable and God became more and more good. As some have noted, that towards the end of the 20th century, God is just this extremely loving being, and what all he wants for you is for you to know his love. That's sort of become a big part of Christianity. And so consciousness and fear of hell, which I'm doing a great courses on the Vikings, hell is actually a Norwegian god. Isn't that interesting? Infierno in Spanish, of course, comes from the Latin, but hell comes from the Vikings. Well, that's very interesting. Anyway, whether or not we fear this life, there is nothing to fear. And for that reason, you've got anxiety about death, about afterlife. Well, the atheist will try and quell that by saying it's just a big sleep, nothing to fear. But now you've got a psychedelic, which, well, if the atheist argument doesn't really help, take the psychedelic, and then that might help, but it might push you more towards the spiritualist side of things. What people then stop noticing is that now there's no moral consequence to living. And all of these tools that we use to shame or bully or pride people into certain moral behaviors or moral postures, one way or another, sort of stop working. At least you no longer have the afterlife argument to employ. An idea commonly conveniently forgotten because they continue to demand morality from people. And so at some point, when you're trying to demand morality from someone, they'll say, "You can't really make me, can you?" And they have a point. So you have the continual problem with morality, and this is something that that both of these camps really struggle with in some ways. Not actually practically, because sort of the sociological pressures one way or another actually do pretty good at forming people's morality and keeping them sort of in the middle of the road. But if people think too long and too hard about it, they might begin to just say, well, they might begin to become a nihilist, which that doesn't usually go too well. They regularly give moral sermons about contemporary moral crusades. People in both camps. They might say there's no hell and afterlife, it's all just going to be wonderful. Or they might say afterlife is the big sleep, but it doesn't stop them from giving their moral crusades. It's against suffering. And of course, someone might say, well, you can't say that. Well, why not? You going to stop me from thinking it? It just doesn't work. Appealing to someone, usually what it winds up doing is appealing to someone's sense of pride, their reputation, or their standing in the community. That's the only backstop they have. Now, the optimistic contemporary spiritual pluralists share this problem. There's no hell or judgment day, yet they still deal in oughts. And everything is okay, and of course the only thing that there is to fear is fear itself, and the only thing there is to avoid is suffering itself, because after death, well, there's no more suffering then, right? And again, you can see how this is sort of a folk Christianity application out there everywhere. Everything is okay, and the only reason we fall short is we understand or don't appreciate that we are all, child molesters included, I suppose, glorious beings of light. Now, some shrink back from this, like the guy in school, because, well, maybe he loses status if he doesn't, he loses his reputation as someone who says, as a physicalist. Others take it all the way. Now, psychedelics, I think, are a reliable evangelistic technique for making people more open and then probably loosening up people from their physicalism. That seems to be what it does. And again, some might go to traditional Christianity. Some might go to, just be optimistic spiritualists. But that seems to be the effect, at least on people's lives. This is the group that mostly benefits numerically from this development. And right away, the book is intended to soften rationalistic physicalists without too much confrontation. You can stay an atheist. It's just, you'll just stop being publicly dismissive of spiritualists. Can't we all get along? You can keep your social status by saying, as school does, the grave is it. But maybe you, like Steve Jobs, will say, well, maybe there's more, and then it's lights out. The main problem remains, though, that eschatologically and in terms of a track record, I'm not buying the retcon Christianity story, and I'm also not buying that you actually can have a coherent eschatology or that you have much of a track record for this. The psychedelic lifestyle hasn't been tried. Well, I think it has. The rationalistic world hasn't yet come to pass, and I don't think it's coming. Now, something that lurks, at least for a traditional spiritualist like myself, the unearned wisdom thing sort of haunts, and it's sort of the Nazi face melting in the Indiana Jones movie. And again, I'm surprised Jordan continues to sort of dabble with this, but then I shouldn't. He dabbles openly online, as do I, so maybe I shouldn't cast stones. Why was it the best kept secret? Why did they want to keep it secret? Were they withholding? Maybe they didn't believe it would yield to a better world. Maybe they, like almost all traditional spiritualists, including the non-Christians one, believed that the spiritual world was actually a world of great hazard and great power, and it was fraught. And again, this is where sort of the optimistic spiritualists and the rationalistic physicalists sort of have it in common, that there's nothing to fear out in the spiritual world. Well, one of the conversations I have coming up, a guy spent some time with the Navajo. What I've seen in the New Age movement is sort of a ransacking of ancient spiritual storehouses, but in sort of a naive way. It's kind of the kid getting led into the gun cabinet and imagining we can just point these and play with these and nothing will go wrong. Traditional spiritualists, Christian or otherwise, look at that and say, you're playing with loaded weapons. But again, this is your ontology. You're a traditional spiritualist. You believe the weapons really are loaded and bad things can happen, and not just medical bad things, such as a physicalist might assert. Maybe it's the best kept secret because the ancient people kept the gun locker locked because they believed in the wrong hands, in the wrong way, this was truly dangerous stuff. That's my thesis. Traditional spiritualists across the board, including pagans, didn't believe that it was responsible to act as if this was merely trippy Jamba Juice. All the physicalist, moralist window dressing still doesn't take the ancients seriously enough. That shouldn't be a surprise. They're dismissive of spiritualists. That's their ontology. Take it in an unworthy manner is what the Apostle Paul talks about of the sacrament of the Eucharist. And now if you want to believe that ancient church Eucharist was laced with a psychedelic, or if you want to believe that maybe that happened incidentally a time or two just because they didn't have great controls on wine or bread production, or if you want to believe it never happened, I don't care. But with respect to the Eucharist, the Apostle Paul says, some have taken it in an unworthy manner and gotten sick and died. So I would color the Apostle Paul a traditional spiritualist. And I think this is part of the reason mystery secret cults kept their secrets mysterious, because they didn't believe this actually worked out there in public, sort of like Livingstone's orgy night. Modernists, however, don't believe this. And so sort of like the Nazis opening up the Ark of the Covenant and their face melting, it's kind of what traditionalists fear. Ontology still matters, and the assumptions still matter. They tend to trickle down. Now, most people don't pay much attention to it, and most people sort of live on the folk level, on the practical level, which means that their ontology is pretty fuzzy. How it connects up with their epistemology or the axiology is all pretty fuzzy, and I'm sure mine is plenty fuzzy too, because all of these abstractions and systems are, in fact, ways that we're trying to make sense of the very messy, very muddy, very fudgy human experience, which we're all sort of swimming through one way or another. Our beliefs are preconsciously imbibed and unexplored, and much of our practice is mimicry and often for status. But yet, we find these tools, such as philosophy, helpful in sort of figuring out, well, if you start as a physicalist, you're probably going to have these takes on psychedelics. If you're a spiritualist, you're probably going to have an optimistic spirituality, as opposed to almost all traditional spiritualities that said, there's good and bad behind that door. Be careful what you play with. So my prediction, going to make a prediction. The psychedelic dream will remain unrealized. Livingstone's orgy night will be a flop. It won't be at all. So don't bother signing up. And if someone calls you asking for a VIP ticket to the Livingstone's orgy night, it's a scam. It's not from me. Might it grow and become more mainstream? Might they find some therapeutic uses for these drugs in certain cases? Could be. If it's helpful, I'm all for it. With limitations. Just like, well, I don't discourage people from, I should correct that. I don't always discourage people from working with their doctor to deal with their anxiety or their bipolar or their schizophrenia. There's a number of schizophrenics that I have in my life that I sure wish would talk to a doctor and take some pharmaceuticals to address their schizophrenia. I know a number who just won't go there, and they and their family suffer for it. And so if I'm all for studying these drugs, if they can find therapies that are helpful, I'm open. I'd be for it. If in certain ways, in certain cases, some of these drugs can help people beat their addictions, lower their anxieties, be more open, when more openness would be good for them, I'm probably a person that if I got more open, it wouldn't be a good thing. So if you see Livingstone's orgy night and the sign up for it, you'll know Paul got too open. Get Paul off the psychedelics. I look at pot this way. I think on the whole, legalization, I'm sort of dubious. I see a lot of people experimenting with it. People that might surprise you. And on the whole, again, for most people, if the rest of their life is intact, they'll sort of figure it out and it won't be a problem. So it should be criminalized. I'm not sure about that either. Again, I'm sort of in the middle of all of these things. But I think just handing out pot all over the place. I know a lot of people who smoke pot and it's not really helpful. I know a number of people who used to smoke a lot of pot and they gave it up because it wasn't helpful. And it wasn't helpful in all of the practical ways of being a good spouse, holding down a job, raising a family, being anxious about what you should be anxious about, and not worrying too much about what you shouldn't worry too much about. Again, it's all really hard to figure that out, and it's all connected with your moral worldview. But will it change the world? I don't think so. I don't think so. Not in the ways that a lot of its promoters project. That's my opinion. I might be wrong. Because this is the second video, there won't be as many commenters because a bunch of people just read the title, left a message, got out of there, and didn't listen to the full 2 hours. Fair enough. But, yeah, those are my thoughts. Will there be more? I don't know. I feel a little done with it for now. But again, I'll be away on vacation, and maybe I'll have more thoughts when I come back. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment. Leave a few hundred. Bye-bye.